Hello to everybody. Thank you for the invitation. Just as Matea already mentioned, last 4 years I have been dealing with the concept of the garden, so there was not much room for the forest. So this presentation is therefore rather a sketch of a thesis, a compilation of pieces of my previous research, of my teaching, and of my childhood experiences, pieces and also of the observation what is currently going on around us and here, and is one way or the other connected to the forest. My attempt is to introduce the forest as a complex element of cultural landscape, some of it we just heard, and an important factor in cultural identity. It will focus on the semiotics of forest spatial perception, and will do so in the form of a collage, presenting perspectives of and from the forest, mostly from Slovenia, which will together expose a range of contradictions. Forest is a space of freedom which evades control, but because of this, it is also a space where laws do not apply. Forest is a sanctuary and also as a place that is filled with danger. As a space of the transcendent, for example, the sacred grove, and also as a space that has experienced profane exploitation. And all of this, in addition to the fear, awe, and scientific inquiry, determines our current relation to the forest in light of contemporary ecological and sociological problematics. Just allow me to remind us, because I'm going to talk about it, the perception, how the perception is formed. The perception is formed within means of social communication through the state apparatus, which are still active, according to Althusser. School, politics, today more corporately owned media, and of course the now prevailing social media, where actually everything goes. As a landscape architect, I see forest as a part of landscapes. Let's start with this. And as a landscape in itself. As it can be seen from many standing points, it can be and is perceived differently according to the scale and point of observation. And with this work by Polonca Lovšin, I think it very lucidly captures the contemporary perception of the forest with the multitude of interests that apply to it. Because the perception of the forests are defined by interests. The perception, evaluation, and experience of the environment are all connected with the needs to exist and act. In The Open, Man and Animal, Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben points out how, contrary to the classical science, Jakob von Uschel, the ecologist from the turn of the 20th century, set forth an infinite variety of perceptual worlds, all as perfect and interconnected as in some sort of an extensive musical score. To this, Agamben adds, there does not exist a forest as an objectively fixed environment. There exists a forest for the park ranger, a forest for the hunter, a forest for the botanist, a forest for the wayfarer, a forest for the nature lover, a forest for the mushroom picker, a forest for the lumberjack, and finally a fable forest in which the little Red Riding Hood loses her way. So this is the illustration of My Childhood by Marlenka Stupica. So let's look at some facts. This is the area between Ljubljana and Kranj, taken from Google. Forest is a land use closer to nature, most closer to nature, with minimal deviation from the primordial. According to landscape ecologists Richard Foreman and Michael Godron, forests are main patches in the ecological networks, and in relation to their size act either as metrics or as stepping stones. The later replacing corridors and allowing natural processes to take place in spite of human-inflicted discontinuities, mainly enabling passage of smaller and larger animals from a patch to patch and to the matrix. Where forest is the climax in the natural succession, the area is covered with a complex ecosystem in which changes are slow and gradual. It needs less maintenance than other categories of cultural landscape, such as fields and meadows, which, to maintain their productivity, need constant intervention. Forest is one unit in landscape that is largely self-supplied with what is needed. While most of the cultural landscape is structured in geometrical order, and thus rather easily comprehensible, forests are less orderly in these terms. They represent, and often a great deal they also truly are, a pristine nature, complex and unfathomable. The order of nature embodied in the forest is inexhaustible in providing opportunities for experience. Interestingly, that the existential and emotional entanglement of man between these two orders is immutable was already pointed out by Immanuel Kant in the Critique of Judgment. Therefore, in today's anthropogenized world, the forest as a representation of the genuine nature is all the more important. If we humans were not here in Slovenia, most of Slovenia would be covered by forests. All of our agricultural and, for the most part, all of our inhabited world has been taken from the forest, which is represented by this image of a cultural landscape near Ljubljana. The forest has been cleared, our territory deforested for agriculture, which is also reflected in the haste with which the forest grows over the abandoned farmland. It is necessary to point out that, as the opposite to the agricultural land, to the intricate, traditional, or more blunt industrial patterns of fields, orchards, vineyards, and meadows, signs of civilization, forest is still a symbol of nature. And also is de facto nature, the wild, untamed, uncivilized, but only together in their dialectic relationship, this human order and natural order form the base of our cultural landscape. What is amazing, actually, in Slovenia is that that has been discovered by the survey conducted between 1992 and 1995, just after the political change in Slovenia, hence providing a lot of material connected with the revived sense for national identity, and published in 1998 as Landscape as a National Symbol, interestingly showed that even if Slovenian national territory is more than 58% covered with forests, the forests act only as a backdrop to the traditional cultural landscape. It's not comprehensive in the image of Slovenia. And this is shown, this is much later from 2001. It's a commercial designed by Gorazd Bauhan, 2000 for the Generali insurance, obviously. And the forest is the backdrop. What domesticates the foreigner is the agricultural landscape, which together with the highest mountain, the Triglav, became a national symbol. If the study would be conducted today, almost 30 years, it's an old study, almost 30 years later, it might have produced different results. However, this is highly unlikely, since some of the codes that define our perception of the forest are very tenacious, and very old fears are very perpetuous. So my question is why? Why is it so difficult to break this model, this cultural model? The semiotics of the forest, spatial perception in the Western culture, at least partially, emerge from the structural characteristics of the forest, that it is pathless, not easy to survey, that it's dark and unfathomable. Structurally, in terms of space, and here I'm talking about space as an abstract category, you know, like X, Y, Z, the forest is structurally very uniform. The elements are repetitive, and the repetition is ubiquitous. The space is condensed, impenetrable. So the forest is an example, at least for a Western, of too much complexity. Our perception is overloaded with impressions. Of course, the forest has its advantages, but that is another aspect to consider, and we have heard about it already. If we talk about structure, the forest is at the extreme end of the dynamic and varied relationship between planes and volumes in the landscape. The relationship between a simple flat surface, say a meadow or a pasture, on the one hand, and a forest on the other, which is why there are too few visual contrasts in the forest. And in this respect, forest complexity is often frightening. For example, here's an example from Pokljuka, which clearly shows this relationship, the structural relationship between what is open and what is enclosed. The limits of the possibility to service one's path and therefore to predict one's future action in the landscape is the key subject of my Professor Janez Marušić's essay, The Garden as an Experience of the Promised World, which has been published in the book Garden and Metaphor. And of course, he's using the example of Dante's Lostness in the Woods, Inferno Canto Primo. I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward pathway had been lost. Ah me, how hard a thing is to say what was this forest savage, rough and stern, which in the very thought renews the fear. So bitter is it, death is little more. This example exposes Western fear of the uncertainty associated with the forest. Of course, Dante used the forest as a metaphor for the crisis in life, and yet it seemed significant that he had chosen the relationship to an element of landscape to do so, concludes Marušić. Again, digging in the typology of landscape, forest is the opposite of a garden, the latter being a place safely secluded from the hostile world, in which man has no control over nature. The idea of the Silva Oscura, presented by Dante, of the forest as a place dangerous and terrifying, differs profoundly from the Arcadian model of the harmony among all beings, not only human and non-human, but also real and imagined, which originates in the ancient forest, and also differs profoundly from the idea of a garden. Here again is Marlenka Stupica with the illustration of the Snow White, precisely showing this complexity of the Arcadian model of the forest, which is frightening but inviting and friendly at the same time, but also differs profoundly from the garden. The bestiality of the Arcadia, with the instinctive, sensual joys, has been excluded from the garden as it developed in the Western world. In the time of the Renaissance, the bestiality of the Arcadia has been neatly stowed in a grotto. Here's the grotto from the Villa Medici in Castello near Florence, built in 1540. So the bestiality was acknowledged but secured, together with the mythological creatures that deviated from the prevailing ideology. One example stands out as its own antithesis, the Giardino degli Mostri at Bomarzo, mid-16th century. The creators of the garden, Vicino Orsini and Piero Ligorio, were in their own way following the spirit of the times, or not. Their reasons are not entirely known to us. But their garden is the antithesis of the accepted symbolism of the garden as of the ordered universe. It is like an inside-out turned a grotto. Here's are more images because it's difficult to capture with one photograph. It appears, and here I'm stating Marušić again, to be a protest against the enclosure of a human environment within the world as an earthly paradise, a protest against the idealized experience. In reality, the world is cruel and unforgiving, writes Marušić. All possible monsters attack man: earthquakes, plagues, beasts, wars, floods, invading Hannibals with their elephants. And merciless time reigns over all, burying beneath the soil magnificent antique temples of which we can only catch a glimpse of a corner store here and there. So the symbolism of the garden, of the humanized nature, of the human order from history is still active in our consciousness. However, it is time to raise the question whether this perception, of course, is still relevant. Can the symbolism of the garden, home, certainty, reconciliation with time persists, asks Marušić. Can we turn the forest into the garden simply by changing our perspective and embracing the uncertainty as potentiality? I don't have an answer, of course. But forest's specific structure, which created the fear, also has its advantages. Forest is a space of freedom which evades control. But because of this, it is also a lawless space. In either case, forest cannot escape its own contradictions. So let me just tell you about an example that is described in Simon Schama, Landscape and Memory, about the liberties of the green wood, the myth of sylvan liberties. Forest acts as a refugee for the outlaws, as well as for all that are the outcasts of society, which we have just beautifully heard. Forest, says Schama, is a rather newer word assigned to the woodland, and it is etymologically derived from foris, meaning being outside. Let's take an example of the stories from my childhood and the youth, for the children and youth stories by Josip van Dot. This is the movie Kekac by Jože Gale from the early 50s, and what we see, it's Pehta. These stories were written in the first half of the 20th century. The adventures of a brave mountain boy in his early teens these stories introduced Pehta, a female outlaw living in the forest. Pehta in the stories of Kekac is the real woman, and this real woman image is based on the female demon of the Alps, considered, good in some places and evil in others. So good and bad at the same time. Pehta in Kekac definitely was the other, not complacent with prevailing social rules, but also not bad. Mind that it is, at the end, Pehta who, with her knowledge of plants, cures Mojca's blindness. Some reasons for the liberties of the forest are well explained in the case of the quest for the true Englishness in the 18th century England. That's by Schama. As written by him in his thorough study of the relationship between the physical environment and folk memory, enmeshed in the collective cultural consciousness, exposes a true story of Henry Hastings, the Earl of Huntingdon, who was one of the keepers of the New Forest. Citing, his house was called, aptly enough, a woodland, writes Schama, and he entertained his guests in a hollow of an oak tree. His manner was evil-smelling and untidy, half-gnawed marrow bones lying on the carpets, hawks and falcons sat on the scones of the walls, spattering the floor with their droppings, fox skins and polecat pelts hanging from the ceiling. Rude, lecherous, an emblem of English incorrigibility, bloody-minded, freely fornicated earthiness. Hastings became an emblem of the English greenwood, a survivor of the ancient forest, knighthood, a specimen of tradition of wild men and the woods, an Arcadian prince of panic, goatish and greedy. Yeah, that was the Hastings. While it is virtually impossible to disentangle myth from reality in this case, it is precisely for its connotations with the liberties had the filthy terribilitas of Hastings, all crazed and blasted, satisfied William Gilpin's picturesque demand for irregularity. For Forrest was for Gilpin an active critic of the corruption of the true English picturesque in the 18th century, who detested the landscape improvements in the spirit of chinoiserie promoted by Sir William Chambers, the embodiment of the true Englishness. And is this, says Schama, why Gilpin rejoiced in the splendidly horrible, anachronism of Henry Hastings. Sciama continues to tie the lore of the free Greenwood to the opposition to the administrative measures laid over the forests by the Norman rulers, which excluded the woodlands from the use of lay people and secured them for the aristocracy as their hunting and leisure ground. Although in Slovenia it is precisely the aristocracy that we can thank for the old primeval forests we still have, it is worth bearing in mind the social consequences of these measures at the time, from the outlawing of poaching onwards, which co-created the mythology associated with the forest. Yes, bears, wolves, partisans, and migrants. Forest has been a place from which real and imagined perils originate. In the World War II, partisan defense has been led from the forest. Forests for the safest hiding place for the guerrilla combat against Italian and German occupation and their collaborators. In our common perception of the forest, this fact is present as a rational knowledge as well as a mythical polygon with positive and, due to the constant ideological distortion of the facts, also negative connotations. This is Tomaž Laurić illustration for a Janko Lorenzi Mladina commentary on the current migrant crisis. In more recent years, our forests, especially the ones near the territorial borders, are a pathway and not a safe but better than nothing refugee on the Balkan migrant route. This is the phenomenon found in many European countries, mostly to the east, where people in search for a better life are coming from. And I'm not going to lose a lot of words by the green border because all it was said before. But this is the current reality, and that's how, with the, with the media and the social media perpetuous language of fear, it builds again into this old-fashioned perception of the forest. So what would be a path ahead? Maybe a sacred grove? This is an image from Fushimi Inari Shrine in Kyoto, showing a little shrine of kitsune, a trickster fox from traditional Japanese folklore. They also are supernatural creatures. They serve as a mediator, as a messengers between humans and the deities of fertility. And they have contradicting qualities. They are also bad and good at the same time. Because this persistence of the forest as a dark, uninviting place is very well visible through the attempts in Slovenia, I'm talking about, to introduce the new model of a cemetery, drawing on the sacred grove rather than on the city of the dead. The concept of the forest cemetery was introduced to Slovenia by Dušan Ogrin as far as in the 70s. His first work was Cemetery Stara Gora at Nova Gorica, built in 1971. While it is virtually impossible, and repeated many years after with the inauguration of the Srebrenice cemetery, where these photographs are from. So the idea, which started even before the competition in 1989, the actual change in the general perception of the necessity of the model turn is extremely slow. This is partly because it also presupposes a change in the treatment of human remains, such as composting, wrapping bodies in fabrics with fungal spores, which speed up decomposition and alike. But we do have these models. To the left is Roques Blanques cemetery in Barcelona, and to the right is Luisenstädtischer cemetery in Berlin. Even if we do not yet accept the new forms of burial, so if we stay with the ashes as the for now, maybe one of the largely spread and most advanced. And if we use the biodegradable urns or scattered ash, the cemeteries could be looser, forested type, if there would be a societal consensus for it. In many places, as I showed, this is already happening. So at the Department of Landscape Architecture, the biotechnical faculty, we, applying research through design, work with students and when they're learning the basics of designing a landscape, which inextricably links together issues pragmatic and symbolic alike, explore possible applications of this new model of cemetery immersed in the silence of the forest. Meaning that maybe as designers we could invite the forest into our lives. Okay, so these are some examples of the students' work. This precisely drawn by Tim Gerdin in his second year of Bachelor Studies from 2018 and 2019. And with this I will conclude, because this is the a thesis or maybe even rather a caricature, and much more research needs to be done to support it. But maybe if we gradually manage to inhabit our forests with our beloved dead, and if maybe we can break the model which is so stubborn, maybe this could allow us for a more inclusive perception of the forest and thus to a different forest action which will lead to human coexistence with nature. Thank you for your attention.